Hello, everybody, and welcome to our third week of class. We are officially at the halfway point with this week. We are in Module 3, and the material that we will be covering in this module are chapters 5 and 6. So we'll be taking a look at attitudes, sort of as the precursor to understanding and starting to work through the material in chapter 6, which involves stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination. Now, I didn't plan the class this way, of course, but the current times certainly do pull on our heartstrings, our emotions, our fears, our anger over everything that's happened with George Floyd. So I think that these chapters are really timely, and I'm really hoping that you can dive deep and really dig into these chapters, looking at just all the research that goes into trying to understand things like bigotry and trying to understand discrimination and racist acts, such as those that we're seeing kind of surface today. And I'm hoping that it will help shed some light on what are the possibilities for our society and our culture to even begin to overcome some of what we're seeing. But I also want you to understand the history of it. Where does prejudice come from? Can it be eliminated? When does it lead to discrimination? Can someone be prejudiced but not discriminate? And those kinds of factors. So more on that in just a minute. Let's take a look at your to-do list for the week. These are two really important sort of pivotal chapters because especially with understanding attitudes and then the specifics of prejudice and discrimination, they're sort of the precursors for even some future chapters that we're going to talk about when it comes to aggression and pro-social behavior, as well as how we act in groups and how we view ourselves. So I really have a lot of videos this week. You're going to notice it's a little heavier on the videos, but that's only because usually when I teach this class in person, we spend at least 2 to 3 weeks covering just these two topics, these two chapters. So there's a lot here to sort of unpack and get through. But just like you saw last week, I would like you to do the material in this order. This is the order that makes the most sense. You want to be looking over the chapter objectives first, then viewing the lecture slides, maybe even printing those out if you can, or having them open next to you while you're reading. And then you can go ahead and dive into chapter 5, watch the video links that go along with the material for chapter 5, and I'll tell you which ones those are. It's pretty obvious when you look at the titles of the videos what material it goes with, but I will let you know that. Then you want to read the supplementary articles. Article 16 has to do with prejudice and discrimination, and Article 17 has to do with our attitudes and then how our attitudes translate into action. When does one come before the other, and do they always? Once you've kind of gotten through all that material, you've watched all the videos, you've done the readings, then you're going to be ready to post to the discussion board. And again, I just want to remind everybody that you're responding to the original post by Friday, and then you're responding to 3 other people's posts by Sunday. You don't want to be doing these all in the same day. You want to post by Friday. That gives everyone a chance to read over everyone's posts before making a selection of which 3 you would like to respond to. Try to respond to the 3 that tug at your heart the most or that you have something to say about. And remember in your posts that you want to be integrating in the material. Show me what you know. So reference chapter 5 or chapter 6, the concepts within those chapters that help explain the questions that you're being asked this week in discussion. Once you've done that, you'll be ready to take your third exam covering chapters 5 and 6. So let's just dive in. I'm going to do a quick overview of the chapters. As I said, there's a lot to unpack here. So chapter 5, when we look at attitudes, we look at why are attitudes important to social psychologists? What do they tell us about people? How do we acquire attitudes? Mainly, we'll take a look at learning principles, such as operant conditioning, classical conditioning, modeling, and observational learning. These are all ways we learn an attitude. What do we like? What do we not like? Who do we like? Who do we not like? Where do we want to be? Who do we want to be? These are all attitudes we develop via learning through our environment and the people who surround us. We'll talk a lot about the role of social comparison and how we develop an attitude, or formally attitude acquisition. It's just the development of an attitude. We do this a lot when we compare ourselves to others, because that's what informs us of where we should be. Social comparison is a benchmark for who or what we should be or what we should be doing. We'll be talking a lot about reference groups and how we form attitudes, that we don't just form an attitude because we think something. We form an attitude because of what other people think and how we're influenced by other people's opinions and behaviors. Take a look at the functions that attitudes serve, and then the context between linking attitudes to behavior. If you feel a certain way, does that mean you behave a certain way? Are the two linked? If you feel something, will you always behave in line with that feeling or that attitude, or will you sometimes behave in a way that doesn't align with that attitude or that feeling? And this is really where we get into the crux of how attitudes can influence behavior. We'll take a look at concepts like pluralistic ignorance and how it operates on our behaviors, as well as some theories about behavior, such as the theory of reasoned action, the theory of planned behavior, and again, more looking at those links between attitude and behavior. Look a little bit at the field of persuasion. We will look at this some more when we talk about social influence in chapter 8. Again, like I said, these two chapters are very pivotal in building to future chapters that we're going to be covering. So persuasion, how are we persuaded to feel a certain way or think a certain way or buy a certain product? What sort of influence does that have on our behavior? Then we'll also be looking at ways that we can resist persuasion, how we can appeal to other people when our attitudes and behaviors do not fall in line with one another, i.e. cognitive dissonance. This is a term you're going to get really familiar with in social psychology. And then just looking at the hypocrisy when it comes to when our behaviors don't fall in line with our attitudes, the hypocrisy of that. This is going to build to understanding then prejudice, racism, and discrimination. We'll be taking a look at the difference between what those terms mean, understanding inequality between differing groups, and the overall role that stereotypes play in operating on our prejudices. We all hold stereotypes, preconceived notions, thoughts, ideas of other groups of people. These often fit into our schemas that we've built up over time and play off of our emotions. Things in the environment evoke certain emotions out of us. And when a schema is connected to an emotion, it's very powerful. And these can form the foundation of a lot of stereotypes. We'll be taking a look closer at tokenism in its role in stereotyped behavior and attitudes and opinions, and the different standards that we hold for stereotyped members, different groups. We'll be looking at how different groups relate to one another, comparing and contrasting in groups and out groups, groups you're a part of and groups you're not a part of, who is a victim of stereotyping. We'll also be looking at sexism. So we're not just talking about racism here, although that's a huge component. We'll also be looking at sexism, gender discrimination in the workplace, in all environments really, but specifically in the workplace as seen in the glass ceiling and glass cliff effect. We'll be looking at the objectification of females, especially in the media, and its role in video gaming. This is going to come into play even more so when we talk about aggression in later chapters. And then we'll be diving in a little deeper to what was racism of the past versus what is racism today, sort of old-fashioned racism versus the more implicit racial attitudes that we have today. With that, we'll be looking at ways that we can measure implicit racism using the implicit association task. I have a video on that. Ways that we group one another into categories. There's racial categorization, gender categorization, and we do this as a way of stratifying where we belong in the environment, in our social sphere, but that is very prone to errors. And we make some really big errors in doing that, all in a quest for sort of what is our social identity. But we'll be ending with looking at how prejudice affects people and our attitudes about other groups and how we might be able to prevent this. What can we do about prejudice? Can it be eliminated? Can it be reduced? Because that is the goal, right, with education, is to educate people on this topic. All right, so here are your article readings, your lecture slides. The first few videos I have for you are on attitudes. We'll be looking at the components of attitudes. What are the different elements that go into making an attitude? And then how attitudes relate to behavior. And further, how we can use that to persuade or change someone's attitude. Help someone form an opinion about something. So these are Khan Academy videos. They're awesome. They're great because they're short and they get to the key points and key elements. So I love to use these. They're really effective. Also, cognitive dissonance falls in line with Chapter 5 on attitudes. This is when an attitude doesn't match up with a behavior that we have. We feel one thing, we do another. And then we'll get the videos into prejudice and discrimination. We have a crash course video. It's kind of like a quick burst of the topic. Another Khan Academy video on prejudice and discrimination, as well as on stereotypes and how stereotype threat affects individuals. This is a video on the making of the implicit association task, the IAT. It's a very popular, widely used test in many different domains, CIA, FBI, business, to see what sorts of prejudices are underlying that we might not be aware of. We hold implicit prejudices. We all do. Sometimes we're not aware that we even do, but they're ingrained in us because we've grown up with them. And even though we might not ever act on them, or we might not think that we would, they can affect us in a variety of ways. So this talks about that, and this is tied to your discussion question for the week. I may be doing a separate podcast about your discussion for this week, but for now, that's that. And then I have a little bit longer video called A Class Divided. This is Jane Elliott's pivotal study on her third grade classroom and how she kind of created a microcosm of society of prejudice in her classroom, dividing the kids based on their eye color and seeing how it changed their behaviors towards one another. We have a video on gender bias. This is a very quick one. So this is like the longer-ish one that you're going to see. This is a quick one on gender bias, a quick ad on homophobia, And then our feature movie this week is going to be Crash, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about this one in the next podcast. So click on over to that.